two, one.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 99th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman. You and my friends know me as JAG. I am the CEO of the Atlas Society. We're the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like animated videos and graphic novels. Today, we are joined by Johan Anderberg. Before I even get to introduce him, I wanted to remind all of you this is a wonderful opportunity to ask him questions. So whether you are joining us on Zoom or on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, use the comment section and type in your question. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So Johan Anderberg is a Swedish journalist and a writer who has contributed to a number of Swedish publications and international media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal. He recently published a book called The Herd: How Sweden Chose Its Own Path Through the Worst Pandemic in 100 Years. It narrates the improbable story of a small nation that took a startlingly different approach to fighting the pandemic. First, the government issued no restrictions, then it declined to order the wearing of masks. And while the rest of the world looked on with alternately incredulity, condemnation, admiration, and even envy, Sweden stood alone. Johan, welcome again. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And now I want to mention to folks that this book has been published in Sweden. It is not yet published in its hard copy form in the United States, but the Kindle version is available. So I urge you all to check it out. And I know there are a few advanced copies floating around. I got to see Jay Bhattacharya this weekend, and he was saying that he and Martin Kulldorff were sharing their bootleg copy, and highly recommend it as well. So we're going to put the link to the book in all of the chat. So first, however, though, I'd love to just start with a little bit about you. This is your first book, if I'm not mistaken. So where did you grow up? How did you get into journalism, and what led you to want to write this book?
Sure. I'm originally from the south part of Sweden, the one that's really close to Denmark. So, but I've been living in Stockholm for about 20 years, where I started my career as a journalist as well. I think and then I've been working for a couple of Swedish and international magazines. I've been at a magazine called Focus for 10 years, which is kind of a magazine in the same mold of Time magazine or Newsweek. I don't know if Newsweek exists anymore in the US, but
there are rumors.
Yeah, but so, and I think it was 2 years ago now that I started writing this book about the pandemic, which was basically, like, my publisher and we decided that this was kind of the story of our lifetime for Sweden. That I don't think, actually, I know that Sweden has never been in the international spotlight as much as during the last 2 years. When the Swedish Foreign Department made a study, it showed that the number of articles was like 100 times more than it normally was about Sweden. So it's kind of interesting to see how the rest of the world looked on while we conducted what the rest of the world saw as this experiment.
Okay, well, so the Swedish strategy has been dubbed the Swedish experiment by both detractors and champions, and it defied the lockdowns and the mandates deployed in most other countries in the world. So what were the chief features of it that differentiated Sweden's approach from other countries, and what made Sweden choose such a different path?
I think the key features were that there were very few laws that the pandemic strategy was based on. It was all based, pretty much everything was based on recommendations and information to citizens, but also a lack of restrictions. Like for instance, with face masks, I've only used a face mask in Sweden maybe 2 or 3 times in total, maybe for a total of like 20 minutes. And my kids have never ever worn face masks. They have never missed a day in school. And I think the biggest reason for Sweden taking this path was that they had no evidence that lockdowns would work. There was no data suggesting that such an approach would be beneficial to like stemming the spread of the disease. And they were also pretty sure that it would be extremely harmful to public health.
Mm-hmm. How many children do you have, by the way?
2, 6 and 12 soon.
Okay, and since this received a lot of criticism early on, was Sweden pressured from, let's say, the World Health Organization or neighboring countries to kind of toe the line on lockdowns and mandates?
I don't think they were pressured, but it was more like they were nudged by other public health professionals in other countries who were criticizing them. And it's kind of funny. I try to describe this in my book, that it's such a small world, this epidemiological elite in Europe and also in the US. Like everyone knows each other. And I think everyone was kind of surprised that like in this little circle that so many countries locked down. And
Mm-hmm.
but what was interesting was that especially in the neighboring countries, the Scandinavian public health professionals at first didn't want to lock down, but then they defended the lockdowns quite vehemently, even though they had been quite against it at first. So there was kind of a herd mentality forming, I think. At least that's what I can get from like reading all these emails between the different public health professionals.
Well, tell us a little bit about the title of the book. When you talk about the herd mentality, I had been thinking of the title in a different light, that Sweden was going to protect the vulnerable, but try to get more quickly to the path where it became endemic and less people would be affected. So how did you choose that title?
Well, I think it's basically just because of the double meaning is kind of intentional, because as you say, the herd, in one way it speaks to the herd immunity approach that Sweden chose, and then kind of denied that they chose, because it became so politically incorrect to talk about herd immunity for maybe 18 months. Now it's kind of back in vogue, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of the title speaks to the herd mentality that the rest of the world suffered under, I think. But it's kind of interesting with the herd immunity approach, because Denmark, who were kind of locking down and were kind of using face masks, but not nearly as much as the rest of Europe, they just got tired of it this winter, and then they started talking about herd immunity. But then they coined a new word called population immunity, just
to be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, it's like basically the same thing. But then they like everyone in Sweden was like, what are you doing? Why aren't like all international media coming to Denmark saying you are like conducting a terrible experiment? So
Yeah, well, so I'm going to get a little bit later to the results, but I am curious about Sweden and its neighbors because many predicted that the Swedish approach would lead to disaster. That didn't happen. Sweden is among 6 European countries with excess mortality less than 100 per 100,000. The other countries, several of the other countries sharing that ranking are Denmark, Finland, Norway, and then Ireland and Switzerland. So how similar or how different were the strategies pursued by other Scandinavian countries, and were the results kind of roughly the same, or is there anything about how the results differ that that can kind of give us some retrospective judgment about the wisdom of their differing approaches?
Well, Denmark and Norway, Finland, they did close their schools for a while, but I believe all those countries were earlier in opening them up again. So in one way, they were like more open than most of Europe as well. But compared to Sweden, it was quite a big difference. And I don't know how familiar you are with like the Scandinavian national characters, but it was very surprising for everyone in Scandinavia because normally Denmark is seen as the liberal country where there are very few laws and people are free to do pretty much what they want. And when my book was reviewed in a Danish newspaper, there was a top comment that said, it's such a shame for us that the Swedes for once turned out to be more chilled out than we were. Because in Denmark, Swedes are called Germans dressed up as human beings, but we are like very controlled and careful people. Like everyone wears a bike helmet, even though there's no law for it, and no one in Denmark uses a bike helmet.
Interesting. But at the end of the day, it sounds like there was some difference that they locked down, and even though they opened up relatively earlier than other European countries, but in terms of the health outcomes, that they were more or less the same.
Yeah, and when it comes to deaths through COVID, I mean, those numbers are a little bit hard to figure out. But in general, Iceland has the lowest number, and Norway has twice as many dead per capita, and Denmark has twice as many dead per capita as Norway has, and Sweden has twice as many as Denmark has. So there's like even though all Scandinavian countries have very few deaths, that there is a big difference between them. But it's also a little bit strange to dissect this much, because when deaths are this low, you have to think about all the other problems in society. And should you really measure Denmark and Norway against each other like that when there are so few deaths anyway? I don't think. I think there were probably a number of diseases at least in Norway and Denmark that produced more deaths during those years. So it's kind of interesting how all the media was so interested in just one disease for 2 years.
Yeah. Well, do you get in your book? Do you get into a bit more about some of the other adverse health consequences and how Sweden fared by taking this lighter touch?
Yeah. For instance, when you ask young people how they look at their future, Sweden has pretty much the same result like this year from last year and the year before that. Whereas young people's optimism has dropped by a lot in most European countries. Mm-hmm. And I noticed also that reports are coming out from the US about teen health and how young people are feeling in general. So I did get some of that in the book. There was one study in Denmark that followed pupils in one class, and they gained around 12 pounds on average during 1 year, while their school had been closed for like half a year or something like that.
Well, I want to also encourage those who are joining us, whether you're joining us on social media or on Zoom, please ask your questions about Sweden. We're focusing on the Swedish experiment and Johan's book, The Herd, but Sweden is in the news in other ways recently, so we'll take your questions. He may or may not answer them. Another question that I have was about the man who pioneered the Swedish approach, or at least in part, and that is, I hope I won't botch his name, Anders Tegnell.
Oh, perfect.
So he's become a bit of a celebrity with, I understand, some Swedes going as far as to get tattoos of his likeness. So how much access did you have to him? How accessible was he? And to what extent did his strategy reflect either, the consensus that you were talking about earlier in Swedish public health circles, or was it just this man with his independent vision going alone?
There were actually, I'd say, two men who were really important here. It was Anders Tegnell, and then it was his mentor, Johan Giesecke. And they have been working together for like 20 or 30 years. And Johan Giesecke even calls Anders Tegnell his son. Wow. Tegnell doesn't reciprocate by calling Giesecke his dad, but they spoke to each other every day, even before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, Tegnell brought Giesecke back to the Public Health Authority. So their view on this, and Giesecke is one of the alpha males of European epidemiology. He's written like the textbooks and everything, and together they managed to withstand all the pressure, I think, because in a sense the Swedish strategy wasn't that controversial. It only became controversial after the rest of the world started locking down. So I guess a lot of bureaucrats would have just to keep their job, would have done like everyone else. It's like it's easier to be wrong without everyone else. Mm-hmm. But they are some really they are two really interesting characters. Tegnell has this very knuckleheaded, and Giesecke has this like aristocratic vibe. His dad was like one of the most famous Swedish politicians, and he comes from this like family of power. So he felt it was almost as he had lived his entire life for this moment, I think.
All right. Well, I have more questions for you, but I want to get our audience involved here. So let's see. Carolyn Breen on Facebook asks, what role did vaccines play in Sweden?
I guess the vaccine uptake is a little bit higher than average in Europe. There was a big debate about vaccine passports. The public health against that, but then they were forced by the government to put them in place. But they only lasted for like 5 or 6 weeks, I think, and they didn't really make any difference either. But I was actually quite critical of and wrote as much in a couple of newspapers, and I think it was that was kind of a sad moment in during the pandemic in Sweden. I mean, you only have to use them to get into concerts, or like if there were like over 100 people there, and so I never even used mine. But I think it was still a break with Swedish tradition and with democratic traditions as well.
Okay, Scott Schiff asks, did the experience of being pressured from being the only country who defied lockdowns, did it change Sweden's view of the potential hazards of globalization? So that's a question, or just maybe more specifically, whenever you go through an experience like this and you withstand pressure, I think it can just change your perspective on a lot of things.
I think the most important thing that changed in Sweden when it came to like the view of the outside world was that we stopped trusting established foreign media the way we trusted them before, because there were so many reports from like the Guardian, the New York Times that were like that had so many factual errors that I think it was kind of incredible to read, and I really urge people to find it. I think you can, if you just Google it, you'll find it, because there was one report in the New York Times that that was found to have, I think, 15 or 16 factual errors about Sweden, and easy ones as well, that like any high school student in Sweden knows about how the Swedish political system works.
Fascinating. Well, and then what about the Swedish press? I mean, here in the United States, during 2020, the media was just mercilessly criticizing everything that President Trump did. And then, of course, maybe the state that's been one of the more open ones here in the United States is Florida. And, they just talked about DeSantis's death cult. So it was pretty adversarial here at home to any politicians that pursued a more open path, or a more kind of a measured trade-off, cognizant path. How did the Swedish press, as a member of the press yourself, how did they react?
There was a pretty good debate for the first couple of months where we were like weighing pros and cons, and it was a pretty harsh debate. But that was kind of understandable, because a lot of things were at stake, and at this time people thought that many more Swedes would die from the virus eventually. There were reports from universities saying that 100,000 people would die in Sweden in just a couple of months' time. And the actual result ended up being 6,000. But no one could know that at the time. So I totally understand why people were scared and wanted changes. And so there was a good debate for a couple of months. But then slowly, the Swedish press became more pro-lockdown. And during the press conferences, politicians and public health authority personnel were always asked why more wasn't being done, and so on. And I think a lot of the foreign criticisms were trickled in, because Swedish media executives are kind of a part of, like an international intellectual community where they read the New York Times online. And, I mean, I do too still, and the Wall Street Journal. But I mean, because you have to read those newspapers to get a sense of what's going on in the world. And but I've been more cognizant of, I guess, the underlying assumptions in the reporting 2 years ago.
All right, from Instagram. Iron T asks, has the economic damage of lockdowns in other countries affected things in Sweden?
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Guess, supply chains and all of these.
Yeah, Sweden is an extremely export-driven economy. Like almost all our GDP comes from exporting stuff, like from Spotify to Volvo and all that. So we were kind of damaged as well here in Sweden. But consumer spending held up, and the service sector was not as badly hit as the industry. So it could have been much worse. I'm actually like skiing now, and like on the Norwegian side of the mountains, everything was closed. So all these like small towns were like really depending, like resorts, they actually had their like best year ever.
Mm-hmm. Because other people were coming to Sweden?
What? Sorry?
Because other people from other Scandinavian countries were coming to Sweden to ski or to vacation?
Yeah, and that was like the like the ridiculous thing, that there were so many Europeans coming to Sweden to party and to and even the Norwegians came out. So it didn't make any sense at all with these lockdowns over there. Yeah.
Well, we had a similar phenomenon here in the United States, that people from New York and New Jersey, two states that had some of the harshest lockdowns and the worst, incidentally, health outcomes, they were constantly going to Florida. They were criticizing Florida, they're killing everybody in Florida, and the first thing they would do is they would go to Florida. So that maybe answers one of the other questions that I have here from Facebook. Echo Wind is asking, were the borders closed? So how did Sweden handle international trade and tourism?
Yeah, borders were closed here and there, like all the time. It's like impossible to keep track
of. You don't have open borders. Really?
Well, there was a time when we had between 89 and I think 2 years ago. Yeah, but the sad thing was that borders in Scandinavia have been open for so long, but that has also stopped. It actually stopped a little bit with the migration crisis in 2015. But that has been a big problem, especially in the south of Sweden. But yeah, what was the question again about borders?
Yeah, whether the borders were like, a lot of countries, the United States, we, said that we're not going to accept flights from these countries, and other countries just said they really kind of closed themselves off from the world, like Australia. So a lot of things were going on as normal in Sweden. The schools were not interrupted, the restaurants, events were not interrupted, religious organizations and commemorations weren't interrupted. But did you also continue the pre-pandemic kind of border and travel policies, or were there restrictions on travel and borders?
There were no restrictions within Sweden. There was only like a recommendation to not
right.
more than 2 hours by car. So there's actually a part of the constitution that says it's forbidden to restrict movement within the country. So I think that helped a lot. And also Sweden was pretty late in closing borders. I think they closed it towards Denmark for a while, but I think that was just out of political spite to just show now you got a virus and you close it for us, so now we're going to retaliate. I don't know. It was just a very strange.
So I gather from some of your writings that this approach to the coronavirus pandemic was different than previous Swedish public health approaches to other crises. So was this a question of the pendulum swinging? How did Sweden's approach to the coronavirus differ from its previous approach to other public health crises?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because historically Sweden has had a very tough stance on epidemics and pandemics. And that
Germans dressed up as Swedes.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it really peaked in the 1980s. And I know the story in the US is that government acted too soon when it came to AIDS. But here in Sweden, the history is like the complete opposite. That the general view is that authorities did way too much and put infected people in prisons and like special prisons and stuff. But I think the reason that could go on was that the people who were infected by AIDS were mostly immigrants coming from Africa and homosexual men that no one liked back then. So there was like never any public pressure to end the regime. But afterwards, it's been seen in a very bad light. So some historians, like especially one historian that sits next to me at my office, he has this theory that the pendulum swung. But I think the main reason for Sweden taking this path is that it was the scientifically sensitive. It was the scientific route, and the people at the helm were strong enough to uphold it. That's like the main explanation, I think. And there's also one other interesting little quirk in the Swedish constitution that says that all Swedish authorities are independent of the government. And so it's almost like an American court that can't be swayed by a politician. So some foreigners think this is really strange. Like if you're the minister of head, that's the head of the police, you still can't tell the police what to prioritize. You have to like write a special paper every year, and it has to go through like this process. So that also made the authorities less susceptible to political pressure, and it also made it easier for the politicians because they could say, it's not our table. It's their choice.
Okay, so it gave them a little bit of cover or wiggle room.
Yeah.
To say that we have kind of a decentralized approach, and we're making recommendations, but people are doing what's best for their locality.
Yeah, and also the Swedish government office is really, really tiny compared to other countries. Like all the expertise is delegated to the authorities, and so there's like no one with a scientific degree in the government agency that can second guess the experts at all the different authorities.
All right. So you wrote an article recently in Unheard, which we're going to put into the chat boxes, called Sweden's Inconvenient COVID Victory. In what ways have the results of the Swedish strategy proved inconvenient for those who were once its biggest critics?
Well, I'm a big fan of Karl Popper, the scientific theorist, and he has this idea of like if a theory is scientific, it has to be able to be falsified. And if you had the assumption that Sweden conducted a dangerous experiment, then you'd want to know the results. So I think it's strange that all these American and British and German magazines and newspapers wrote all these articles and never came back to see how it actually ended. Because a thing that the Swedes, and especially Johan Giesecke, when he was like touring all the international media, a thing he said was that let's come back in a year or in 2 years' time, and you'll see that eventually deaths all around the world will be pretty much the same. He didn't get that completely right. Actually, Sweden ended up lower than he had thought. So I think it's a bit dishonest, actually, for for some international media publications to be so outspoken about something and then not go back.
Not follow up, right? I'm sure they would have followed up if their criticism had been borne out, but perhaps it's inconvenient because to acknowledge what happened is to acknowledge that they were wrong in saying that this was going to be a disaster. And so nobody likes to admit that they were wrong, particularly not the experts and the media. All right, some more questions from our audience. James the Thinker on Instagram is asking about the population density in Sweden. Did that help to reduce the spread?
I mean, if you compare it to England, I think it did, because it's pretty obvious that really dense areas have been hit harder than the opposite. But Sweden is actually quite densely populated where people live. Like Stockholm is a very dense city, as is Gothenburg, as is Malmö. So Sweden is kind of like Canada. Like it's a very big country, but people are like crowded
in the cities.
Yeah.
All right, Ian Brooks on Facebook asks, what are your thoughts on the COVID camps that Australia built?
I mean, it just shows how bad it can get when you decide on something and you can't like back out from it. And I think, or I hope this will go down in history as a really weird thing that democracies did. Because I mean, we've seen this kind of behavior from dictatorships for centuries, but what is really striking about this is like Australia is a real democracy, and still it happened there. So I think that that has made me quite concerned, actually.
Well, maybe it's too early to tell, but what do you think the lessons learned will be? Do you think that people will say, well, gosh, we want to reduce excess mortality from COVID and, or from the next pandemic and from other adverse health impacts? We know that isolating people, locking them down, we know that destroying jobs, destroying an economy, that those also have bad impacts. And do you think people will be more likely to think twice, or do you think that people will say either that they never want to admit that they made mistakes, or that they enjoy having so much power to tell the population what to do?
I think there will be a reckoning eventually, and I think it will happen when one of the major American or British media outlets or journalists decide to really go through it, and you can just see the impact that there's this journalist in the New York Times, David Leonhardt, that have been a bit more nuanced in covering the pandemic. And it has had such a great impact already, I think. And I mean, once the Michael Lewis's or the Malcolm Gladwell's, or like someone like that, really writes this story in the US, pretty much the way I did in Sweden, then then I think people would change their minds. Because all these people who were pro-lockdown, I think they are kind of few. Like most people were just like going along and didn't think too much about it, I think. If you haven't been on the record, it's easier to change your mind, I think.
Now, there were mistakes, I'm sure, in Sweden, and the approach was not without its reversals. So maybe tell us a little bit about what happened and what looking back, if Tegnell or his mentor were to look back and say, these are the things we got right, were there things that they got wrong?
Yeah, definitely. The one thing they did get wrong was early on when they trusted the Chinese data.
Interesting.
For way too long. But someone told me, like someone who came to one of my book readings, told me that maybe that was fortuitous, because since they trusted the Chinese data and thought that the virus wasn't going to come to Sweden for so long, it ended up coming to Sweden. And if Sweden had like an Australian or maybe Norwegian situation with like no virus at all, maybe they would have been more tempted to lock down. But now they're like, it's already here. Let's just let it rip. So maybe it was a good thing, actually. And another thing they got wrong was they thought the vaccine would take 4 to 6 years, and I believe it took like 8 or 9 months. But that was such an amazing scientific breakthrough. But that also factored into their calculations, I think, because lockdowns for 4 years is even more inconceivable than lockdowns for half a year. So maybe that was also lucky that they thought the vaccine would take long.
Yeah, that they kind of miscalculated on that, because people say, oh, well, 2 years of, making toddlers wear masks and, harming our businesses, we can live with that. But if you think it's longer, you have to say, no, we're going to have to figure out another strategy from the get-go.
Yeah. Well, wasn't it just 2 weeks? It was supposed to be.
Yeah. 2 weeks and 2 years and a month later, here we are. Okay, let's see. Woody Cochin on Twitter is asking, is there a particular group or groups that really were the most specifically responsible for the devastations of the lockdowns? So, was it the media that was scaring people, and then people were pressuring governments for these, restrictions? Was it public health authorities that were kind of beguiled by a new, untried strategy of zero COVID? So, who were the ones that were really most responsible?
I mean, I kind of want to say Imperial College and other public health, like epidemiology, who had this like flawed science guiding them. But I think it has to be the media, because if you, as a journalist, you encounter people all the time who want to do this and that because they are like so focused on their area of expertise. They want to have like a certain kind of they want to force kids to wear all kinds of protections, because they wrote their PhD thesis on this kind of injury among kids. And as a journalist, you have to take a step back and like do the cost benefit analysis, and you have to see what other things could this lead to. And there are so many people who want to write laws for everything too. And like, for instance, every time I'm out talking about this, there's always someone who says like, but are you against seatbelts as well? Like, or seatbelt laws? But then I always ask them, like, why do you use a seatbelt? Is it because it's a law, or do you think it's a good thing to wear that? Easy to wear as well. I mean, I wear a seatbelt because I think the police is going to fine me $100.
Right. Well, so that also raises the question of masks. So there were no mask mandates, but people weren't wearing the masks, and you weren't masking your kids, and you've worn masks for all of 20 or 40 minutes over the past 2 years. So again, was it you looked at the data and you weren't buying it, or were the public health authorities saying wear masks, don't wear masks? Were you deciding also maybe they work, but my child is 2 years old and I'm at very low risk? Or did you get it early on? Did you get natural immunity?
I don't know if I've had it actually, because I've only taken the test once when I went to Iceland with my daughter. So I've been ill a couple of times. So maybe it was COVID. I don't know, but with masks, I think it could help if you really know how to use it. But when you think of how many people that have gotten COVID around the world, what it does, it just it could probably prolong the time before you get it. But it's pretty fair to say that you are going to get it eventually. So when you weigh that against the massive inconvenience it is, especially for kids to wear a mask, I think it doesn't make sense at all. And that was what data said also. Like, if you read these emails between the Swedish scientists and some foreign, it's pretty obvious that they think it was bullshit. So, but then they recommended it in subways for 2 hours a day in Sweden anyway, and no one wore them anyway. It's always been very, very rare to see people with masks in Sweden.
And it looks like it. I mean, how? In the United States, it's very politically divided and polarized, and the pandemic and then the responses to the pandemic kind of fell into that political mix. Is there that same level of heated political divide in Sweden? And did the pandemic and the responses or lack of responses in Sweden's case, did that play into it?
It was kind of interesting because we happened to have like a social democratic government at the time. So I guess if it had been a right-wing government,
interesting.
The left would have been more critical, and they would have had like the case of saying like, you sacrifice people's lives for the economy. But now government. So the first thing that the Liberal Party, like the moderates, that's like the center-right party, the first thing they wanted to do, they wrote an op-ed saying that Sweden should have an exit plan. That was like 2 weeks in. So they had a difficult time backtracking from that. And there have been like bouts of like the Nationalist Party had like a couple of weeks where they thought they were going to be able to get some traction, but it never really became a political debate.
Interesting, but you're saying that if and the other party had been in power, that you think that it would have gone differently, possibly.
Yeah, I think so, because then
well, it would have been the same response, right? I mean, who knows what Tegnell and Giuseppe, what their politics are.
Yeah. Funny thing is that I think one is really left wing and one is really right wing, but that's just like my guess. So I thought maybe I shouldn't have said that. But the only thing that became a political issue was the testing, because the public health authority thought testing was kind of useless, but then there was like some political pressure to do it. So, but they never really got any tests, and it is kind of useless to test people like that if you had decided to let it rip anyway. So it never really fit into the strategy. So it was no wonder they didn't really care about it. And I think all this testing in the US and the rest of the world has probably been pretty meaningless as well.
So just picking up on something you said just then, so critics would have said that, well, Sweden has decided to let it rip. And, with like the Great Barrington Declaration, they would say, no, we're not, promoting letting it rip, we're promoting focused protection. But I mean, in reality, is that what Sweden did? Did they take special cases to say, let's prioritize vaccines for the elderly, and the elderly should not go out and should wear masks all the time? Or did they just say, let it rip?
I think this Tegna and the others have been a little bit dishonest when it comes to like what the actual strategy was, because I think it's pretty fair to say that they kind of let it rip. They had this plan to protect the elderly, but that is kind of impossible to do. And but they did give the vaccine to the elderly first. And that worked pretty well, I think. But the Swedish nursing homes have been a disaster for a long time, as it probably is in a lot of countries, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, they certainly were in New York and New Jersey because the governors in those states made the decision that they would house overflow COVID patients of all ages in nursing homes, and that, essentially wiped out.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very thought through.
Yeah. No. So I have to ask you though, is there something about we've talked a little bit about the political context, we've talked about sort of, possible pendulum swing, we've talked about the public health leadership. Is there something special about the Swedish culture or the Swedish character? I mean, if they are, as the Danes call them, the Germans dressed up as Swedes, what is there? Is there something that helped them to kind of be more measured or more moderate and resist the kind of panic and hysteria that gripped and still grips other countries?
I think at least this is what the latest historian researchers are saying about Sweden, is that there's this really strong individualist streak in Sweden, and that is something that foreigners don't always pick up, because people think we elect these like social democrats all the time, but to most Swedes, social democrats are they guarantee some freedoms we value a lot, and if you compare it to the US, in the US, I guess the smallest political entity is the family, whereas here is the individual. So that's why free tuition is such an important thing for Swedish liberty, because we are so free that we don't even want to be dependent on our families. That's how Swedish liberty. And I think there's a lot to that. And also the Swedish society is like way more liberalized than the people think. Almost all markets are totally free market, and it's. I know some people have written about this in National Review and so on, but I think people still think it's like a small version of France, whereas it's more like an American state in some sense.
Yeah, well, previous guests that I've had on this show, Johan Anderberg, he had a documentary, Sweden, Lessons for America, and he showed that Americans don't really know much about Sweden, and that Sweden is really not socialist, it's far more capitalistic, and it shouldn't be used as an example of sort of the public means of production, that it certainly has aspects of a generous welfare state, but it's interesting. So we're just about running out of time. A couple of last questions. What is Tegnell's current status. There were reports that he resigned as Sweden's chief epidemiologist to take a role at the World Health Organization. Is that the case? And if so, what does it represent?
Yeah, that was the news coming out, but I don't know. Lately, it's maybe he's not going to the WHO after all. So I don't know at all what happened there. But when it comes to the WHO, my understanding is that it's kind of like the UN, but it's not always. I mean, you shouldn't read too much into that. It's like a lot of political maneuvering and stuff like that. So it's kind of like being on the Human Rights Council. And
well, I hope that, you know, it would be a case that he would influence the World Health Organization and not that the World Health Organization would co-opt him and, you know, not let something like this independent
it's actually
happen.
I came across some interesting emails, like with because Giesecke was part of the WHO group that handled this pandemic, and he wrote like some emails to the Swedes, gossiping about what the WHO really thought and how it was all politics. And it was kind of so. I always laugh a little bit when I hear like people referencing the WHO as this oracle, when you know it's just like, you know, like FIFA or IOC or any kind of international organization that has like a million different schemers, you know.
Bureaucrats, yeah. Okay, well, I suppose I'm a little bit relieved to hear that they're you know, not terribly competent enough to be enacting some of these schemes. So you wrote the book, published it. I mean, so how much time has passed since it was published in Sweden?
A little less than a year.
Okay, so is there anything that happened in that, you know, almost year since the book was published that you would have liked to have been included? And is there another book on the subject in your horizon?
I think it covers pretty much everything, because when I published it, everyone in Sweden who wanted to had got the vaccine, and Sweden has like ended the pandemic quite a long time ago. Like no one in Sweden has talked about it for ages, it feels like.
Wow.
There was this Corona Commission coming out, and it felt like no one cared about it at all. It was a bad time for them because it happened while Russia invaded Ukraine, but it was kind of interesting to see how people had moved on.
Interesting. Well, speaking of moving on, what is going to be next for you?
Well, I'm kind of thinking of a new book that maybe I shouldn't tell you about, but it has to do with like the complexity that how people underestimate the complexities of society, and how it's easy to think of simple and fast solutions to societal problems. So it's kind of in the vein of this. So, since so many people have appreciated like the tone in this book, it feels like there's a case for trusting people, and not like a new way to write something anti-authoritarian, I think.
All right. Well, we will be watching. You are on Twitter at Johan Anderberg, so we'll follow you there. Any place else that we should be following or signing up for in terms of keeping track of you and your next book?
No, I think Twitter is the only. I try to stay out of Instagram.
Okay. All right. Well, wonderful. It is midnight there. So thank you again very much for staying up to speak with us. Thank you for writing this book, for having it translated into English, and a big thank you from the United States and the rest of us to Sweden for being brave and measured and independent and showing us another path.
Thanks for having me.